Hello, friends. Tonight, I will share with you 3 terrifying first-person stories, each one tied to faith, silence, and the shadows that linger in holy places. The first is about a silent nun who walks the halls long after she should have been buried. The second takes us into a midnight confession, where a voice answers from behind the grill, though no priest was ever there. And the third will lead us to an abandoned abbey on the hill, where the hours of prayer are still kept, even though the sisters are long gone. These are not just stories, they are warnings. So turn off the lights, sit back, and listen carefully.
Here's a story I didn't plan on collecting when I said yes to a weekend maintenance job at St. Bridget's, a small convent halfway between cornfields and a freeway. The sisters ran a retreat house for lay visitors, and the handyman had thrown his back out, so they needed someone to patch drywall, unclog a sink, and look at a sticky chapel door. I figured I'd fix what they pointed to, keep my head down, and enjoy the strange peace buildings like that carry in their hallways. Sister Thomasine met me at the gate in a navy cardigan and orthopedic shoes, the kind of practical kindness that makes you stop wanting to apologize for existing. She signed me in like a guest, handed me a ring of keys that felt old enough to have opinions, and said, "We keep great silence after Compline. If you need anything during the night, knock twice on the office door and wait. Otherwise, let the house sleep." It was October, and the air had that clean, hard edge it gets when the first frost has visited and left everything a degree more honest. My room was on the ground floor of the retreat wing, simple and warm, a narrow bed, crucifix above it, a desk with a lamp that gave off a butter-yellow pool. The work went quickly, caulk here, a stubborn trap there. After dinner, the sisters filed to chapel. I stood back in the corridor as they passed, a quiet line of blue and gray. Most wore simple blouses and skirts. One, in an old-fashioned black habit and veil, walked last, her hands folded so neatly it felt like a lesson. She didn't look up, didn't look anywhere exactly. Her gaze seemed committed to a point 6 feet in front of her, as if following a rule. I thought she was older than the rest, but it wasn't the face so much as the way the fabric behaved around her, like it had learned her shape a long time ago and wasn't interested in changing now. After Compline, St. Bridget's felt like a clock that had decided breathing was better use of the hour. I took a walk through the enclosed garden, boxwood hedges, a statue of the Sacred Heart, last asters bowing like tired dancers. Lights in the retreat wing went to low. A cow truck sighed somewhere on the freeway like weather remembering something. In my room, I read a few pages of a paperback and tried to be the kind of respectful tired that doesn't keep checking the phone. Just past midnight, somewhere between sleep and not, I heard the chapel bell ring once. Not a call to anything, just one hard, careful strike. I lay still. The second strike didn't come. I told myself old ropes move when buildings settle, but my heart did that small double step you can't explain to your brain without sounding foolish. I got up, pulled on a sweater, and walked the corridor toward the chapel. The floorboards in that wing complain in a friendly way. You learn their accents in one pass. At the corner by the library, the air cooled. That's where I saw her, the nun in the older habit, standing with her side to me, as if she'd paused between chapel and some other place. She was perfectly still, hands folded, veil hanging weightless. I did the rude thing, said hello. I whispered it because the house had taught me. She didn't answer, but she bowed her head 1 degree, and then, after a beat that felt measured, lifted it back that same degree, a delayed echo of acknowledgement. I stepped closer so my voice wouldn't have to work. "Everything all right, sister?" The veil turned enough that I could see the line of her cheek, then stopped, as if a rule said that was as far as it could go. Her hands shifted, beads clicked softly once, and then she started walking. Toward chapel, I thought, but she passed it and continued down a hall that ended at a door marked Archive. The key turned for me without a fuss. I figured she was leading and I was deciding to be led. The archive smelled like paper's idea of dust. Metal shelves held labeled boxes and old parish registers with spines like old knuckles. The nun stopped at a small desk under a lamp with a chain pull and lowered her hands as if she were placing something there. There was nothing on the wood, just the worn oval where hands had been forever. She remained that way, a posture, not a person, as if the room had borrowed a shape to remind itself what to do. I pulled the chain. The bulb warmed slowly. The light revealed a ledger open to a list of names written in a careful hand. Donations, dates, notes that read candles, resole shoes, choir stall hinge. The last entry, a little separated from the rest, read simply, "Keep the hours." Someone had underlined it twice with a pencil that dug the paper but left hardly any mark, like the underliner had learned to be present without calling attention. When I looked up, the nun had moved to the door. Not moved. I mean, one eye blink she'd been by the desk, the next she occupied the space by the jamb, hands folded, waiting. She didn't quite face me, but the idea of her attention had shifted so that I was no longer alone with the paper. She turned left out of the archive, and I followed at the respectful distance a person keeps when they are pretending not to intrude. Past the library, the corridor opens into a small antechamber, with a glass case full of community photographs. The old black and whites have the haunted look of history only because time erases contrast. Otherwise, they were cheerful. Gardens, kitchens, a choir caught laughing between verses. One photograph at the far right showed a group of novices from half a century ago. Their names were written in fountain pen ink in small, tight letters. At the end of the row stood a novice in a long black veil, her face slightly blurred by the lens or light. The name under her was Sister Agnes Immaculata, no last name, as if whoever wrote it had never known one. The date was 1964. When I turned back to the hall, the figure was gone. I don't mean gone around a corner. The corridor is short and ends at chapel and office, both closed. The cold at the base of my throat had the taste of a cold that wasn't air temperature. I went to chapel because that's where you go when you're in a place that is built for it. The sticky door yielded with a grunt that felt like permission. Inside, the sanctuary lamp made the far end of the room a red idea. The sisters' stalls held their straight-backed patients. I sat in the last row to the right, not because I had a plan, but because sitting in the last row is a way to not disturb anything that knows its own order. The bell rope hung in its niche like a passive animal. I reached out and touched it with a finger, and the bell above hissed a little iron dust down the rope, like pollen. I let go. After a beat, one measured second, the rope swayed very slightly, as if a second hand had touched it late. I said, "Okay," out loud. Not a challenge, more a small treaty a person offers an empty room. On the way back to my bed, I passed the office. The door stood open a thumb's width, and inside, the small lamp over the desk made a cone of amber on a stack of index cards. The card on top was a prayer card with a black and white portrait of a young woman in a long veil, the same smudged face from the photograph. On the back, in the same tight hand that had labeled the archive photos, someone had written, "Sister Agnes died the night the west bell cracked. Internment, cloister plot. Vows, silence." I wasn't scared exactly. I felt watched for right conduct, the way a test watches a student. I slept near morning and dreamed nothing I remember. At breakfast, Sister Thomasine poured coffee and asked if the work had gone well. I said yes and asked if they still had any sisters in the older dress.
"Only for funerals," she said, and smiled like a person who knows funerals are more for the living than the dead. I mentioned a photograph in the case and the name on the card. At Sister Agnes, a small considerate pause came into the room the way a breeze enters through a screen. "That was a long time ago," she said gently. "She kept silence very perfectly." I asked, before my common sense visited, if Sister Agnes had a habit of walking the halls after Compline. Sister Thomasin's smile didn't move. "After Compline," she said, "we sleep." I spent the afternoon replacing a hinge on the choir stall, the one the ledger had mentioned. The wood had swollen, and the screws had rusted to a brown that left their shape at my fingertips. While I worked, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, soft rubber soles, practical shoes. A shadow moved across the frosted chapel glass. I wanted to call out, and didn't. When the hinge sat right, and the stall stopped complaining, I stood up and stretched, and felt a small click in the chapel's air, like gratitude arriving by a path that wasn't breath. At dusk, as the sisters filed in, I waited again. The last in line this time was a small woman in a cardigan, no veil, and when she passed, she gave me the tiniest nod. After the service, the bell rang once, one careful strike, and I knew before I stood that the echo I heard in my bones would repeat a second later, as if someone upstairs were learning the timing. I left St. Bridget's before sunrise the next morning. At the gate, I turned the keys over to Sister Thomasine. On impulse, I asked if the west bell had a hairline crack, still visible. She looked pleased and surprised, the way people do when visitors notice a house's private scars. "You can see it if the light's right. It's been there as long as I've been here." I told her the hinge was fixed, and the trap drains righted, and the chapel door less stubborn. I didn't tell her about the ledger's instruction or the hand that touched the bell rope after mine. Driving away, I passed the hedged garden and caught in the reflection of my side mirror a figure in a long black veil moving toward the archive hall. Hands folded, gaze committed to the space in front of her. I didn't turn my head. The mirror gave me one convictive blink and then became sky. If there's a lesson, it's small and doesn't need your agreement. In a house that keeps silence, keep it with the house. If a vow has outlived the person who made it, you can treat that like weather or you can treat it like a timetable. Either way, if a bell strikes once in the night and you feel the urge to answer it, give your answer and then wait one measured beat. Let whoever is keeping the hours keep them. You're a guest.
I've always liked old churches, the way some people like train stations, places built for arrivals and departures, for people who are between things. When I couldn't sleep, I used to walk to a small brick parish downtown that kept the big doors open till late and the side door unlocked for adoration hours that stretched more toward kindness than policy. It was February, hard, cold, the kind that makes your breath feel like a bad habit when you see it. The city had gone quiet after a snow, and the plows had made little walls along the curb that turned every block into a set of rooms. I pushed the side door and felt the old hinges give like knees. The vestibule light burned steady. The nave held shadow the way a lake holds the sky. I wasn't alone. You never are in spaces like that, not really. But I mean there were no other people visible, just the red sanctuary lamp and a flicker from a votive someone had left unextinguished, lay charity doing what it does. I sat in the back, in the cheap pew where the varnish had worn to a soft gray at the top rail from hands more faithful than mine. The air smelled like candle soot and old wood that knows the names it holds up. After a while, long enough that the cold leached out of my coat and left my bones to mind themselves, I heard a door inside the church close with the politeness of someone who knows sound travels. Not the main doors, the small one that leads to the Reconciliation Chapel off the side aisle. I wouldn't have noticed, except that I felt the air change, a thin draught on my cheek, as if the church had turned its head slightly. I stood and walked the side aisle, counting the stations as if I were teaching myself obedience by numbers. 1, 2, 3. The light over the confessional was on, a small practical light. The plaque read, "Confessions, Sat. 3 to 4 p.m., Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m." It wasn't either of those. Still, the lamp burned. I shouldn't have gone in. I'm not a priest. But the small door stood ajar, and inside the penitent side was only a chair, a slender grill between, and the sense that sitting could be a way to be useful to something that had already started. I sat. The chair was too low, the way chairs in confessionals are always either too low or too high.
a small physical reminder that comfort isn't the point. I heard nothing at first, then a breath, close, not from the nave, through the grill, where the screen made a shadow so fine it looked like thought. A voice spoke, soft and careful. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The cadence was old school, a little rehearsed, like someone reading from a card they didn't have to look at anymore. I opened my mouth to say the sentence the sign on the door should have said. "I'm not a priest. Confession is in the parish hall during posted hours." Instead, I said nothing, because the voice continued. I broke silence. I know enough to know that's a thing people promise and fail at for reasons that aren't small. I said because the room had built me a role and I could either refuse it or do it gently. Say what you can. The voice came through the grill in a tone that made a person want to lean forward. A woman's voice, younger than I expected, mid-20s maybe, but flattened by the way people flatten themselves when they talk to rules instead of to people. We were told not to speak after Compline. We were told not to write when we could not speak. A short breath, like someone remembering something tender. But she asked me a question. I answered. I answered in the corridor, and then in the garden, and then I answered in the chapel when the bell rang one time in the middle of the night. That was the night the west bell cracked. I didn't move. The grill made the space between us permanent. I said, "Do you want absolution?" which was ridiculous to say. The voice answered a question I didn't know I'd asked. "I want the hours to be kept the way they were meant." Another breath. "I want the person who has taken my place to stop speaking when she hears her name." My stomach did a small, slow turn, because hearing your name in a place that doesn't know it is a kind of intimate violence, and I'd taught myself to ignore it when it came from inside my own head. I said my name to the grill, quiet, to prove to both of us that I still owned it. The voice repeated my name exactly, but late by a beat, like an echo with intent. My hands went cold. I put them under my thighs and tried to think of something logical. The confessional booth opposite mine, the priest's side, was empty. The light above the kneeler didn't glow. I could have stood and opened that door and confirmed that I was in a box alone, speaking to wood. Instead, I said, because my breath kept wanting to quit, "If you broke silence, what do you need to do now?" The voice said, "Keep it." The word fell into the space between us and lay there like something small that still cast a long shadow. On the other side of the grill, something scraped softly, the polite kind of scrape paper makes against wood. I pictured a hand kneading a handkerchief or a rosary being sorted by fingers more faithful than mine. "The hours," she said again, and it sounded like a title this time. "We keep them. We begin again when we fail. Begin." The word lengthened in her mouth as if the room had become a corridor for sound. I swallowed and decided to be honest enough to keep a building from lying. "I'm not a priest. I shouldn't be in here." The voice didn't react, not surprise, not offense. "You're keeping time," she said. You are here when the quarter turns. I didn't know what that meant until the tower clock in the church narthex, an old brass thing that had survived 2 renovations and a renovation of the renovations, struck once a quarter past, and I felt the chime like a coin dropped in the chest. I said my name again without meaning to. The voice said it a beat later, softer, like someone agreeing to something she hadn't decided. I stood. The chair rasped back. On the other side of the grill something stood too, the sound a calm echo. I opened the penitent's door into the side aisle, which glowed now with the reflected red of the sanctuary lamp. The opposite door remained shut. I circled, as one does when one is about to scold a trick of one's own making, and opened the priest's side. Empty, of course. The smell inside was different, though. Not incense, not wood. Something like rain on stone that hasn't seen rain. On the little shelf beneath the grill lay a folded scrap of paper, the kind you tear off the end of a legal pad. In pencil, small and exact, someone had written, "Keep the hours," the script tilted right. I left the booth and sat in the nave, because walking home under the idea that you might be followed by your own name seemed worse than sharing a room with it. After a while the side door opened, and an older woman I'd seen before at weekday masses came in with a grocery bag full of votive candles. She genuflected with the cranky knees of a person who still believes, and then replaced the burned-down cups with fresh wax. In the act of bending, she looked up and saw me, and gave me the small, economical smile people give you when you're a regular they've never spoken to. I almost asked her if the confessional was scheduled that night. Instead, I asked if the west bell in the tower had ever cracked. "Years ago," she said, lighting a match. "They turned it so the crack doesn't show. Sister Agnes used to say the tone is truer now for having learned how to break." She shook the match and dropped it in the cup. "What a thing to tell a stranger, right?" she added, and laughed once, the way a person does when the world produces a coincidence like a card trick. I walked home in the snow, which had softened a little in the last hour and began to take footprints like a ledger. I said my name once out loud in the middle of the block and counted a beat and did not hear it said back. At my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back to the door like a kid and listened to the building's late-night noises, pretending they had known me all my life. When I took my coat off, a thin gray ash smudged my cuff. I smelled my fingers like an idiot, and the scent wasn't smoke. It was that rain on stone smell, old and not unkind. I went back to the church a week later at a reasonable hour. The confessional lamp was off. The plaque still lied about times only in the way plaques do. I sat near the front this time, because if you're going to keep time for a room, you might as well do it where the light can see you. When the quarter hour struck, I didn't say my name. Nobody said it after me. Still, when the sanctuary lamp flickered from a draught I couldn't feel, I found myself whispering not to a person and not to stone. I will keep the hours I can. I won't speak where I shouldn't. and if a voice needs mine to remember the shape of a reply, it can have one beat's worth and no more. The Abbey doesn't look abandoned until you stand close enough to touch it. From the highway it sits on the ridgeline like something meant to be there. Brown stone with a bell coat, a roof patched in places that the sun forgives from a distance. You could mistake it for a county building that outlived its county. I was doing a fall road trip on back roads, the kind of itinerary you justify by saying you needed to be inside your life without anyone else's voice for a few days. A hand-painted sign on a post read Old Abbey Road, private, and someone had tacked a smaller sign beneath, Hikers Welcome, Respect Property. That seemed like a contract I could meet. I parked at the bottom where the gravel widened, shouldered a day pack, and followed the switchback path up through scrub and oak. The air smelled like last summer's heat leaving, and the cold thinking about where to land. The closer I came, the more the stone said what stone does. I was put here with labor. I learned weather. I learned names. I kept them. The front door was iron-bound wood and refused me politely. A smaller side door into what had been the kitchen yard stood ajar an inch, the way abandoned buildings leave invitations they don't mean. Inside, the cloister walk had lost its glass long ago, and the arches framed the hillside in bright rectangles. The refectory was a long echo, with suspicions of fresco over plaster, saints eroded to gestures. The choir stalls in the chapel had been removed at some point. Only the outline of their feet remained on the stone floor like the negative space around people who'd moved. A swallow had found a home high in the apse and stitched the air with its own agenda. It's an American habit to want a placard when it was built, who lived here, why they left. There wasn't one. You could feel order, though. The kitchen would have been here, the infirmary there, the dormitory above the east walk. I nearly left after an hour of respectful looking. Then I found the guest house, a small two-story outbuilding at the edge of the complex, roof still holding, windows intact behind heavy screens. The front room had the kind of simplicity that makes museums of places. 2 chairs, a table, a small fireplace, and a cross hung at a height that made you straighten. On the table lay a penciled note in a blocky hand. If you shelter here, leave wood, take nothing, close doors behind you. A double underline under close. I hadn't planned to stay, but the note was the kind of kindness you don't turn down, and the day had fallen without asking. Night thickened up from the ravine quickly. The windows held it like a liquid you can see but not drink. I ate a cold dinner from the pack, turned my headlamp to low, and read an old pamphlet I found in the table drawer about the Abbey's founding by a small community of sisters who had come west with little money and a conviction that they would teach and nurse and keep prayer at hours the valley had never kept. The pamphlet trailed off into appeal and addresses. No date. When I lay down on the wooden bench with my jacket for a pillow, the quiet made a dome over the room. The first noise came from above, a footstep that wasn't a footstep, more a board agreeing with the weight of a memory. Then another, a little farther, then the softest run of something like fabric brushing wood. I told myself squirrels have opinions about roofs. I don't think I believed myself. I got up, not fast, walked to the window that looked toward the main building, and saw a light in one of the second-floor windows, a low, butter-colored glow, too warm for moon, too tidy for accident. It moved. Not the light itself, but the shadow its light made, a figure crossing in front of it, a long veil drawn as a line. Then another window farther down took light, as if someone with a candle had entered and set it down. Then a third. I said, "Okay," quietly, the kind of okay that means a person has decided to stand in a place and let the place tell the story the way it wants. The windows made a procession, uneven but steady, as if along a hallway I hadn't seen from inside. The last glow paused in the square that would have been the chapel's upper gallery and held. I didn't realize until I was already doing it that my hand had lifted at my side and made the smallest of crosses. I'm not in the habit of crossing myself. Sometimes your hands know things, your head doesn't audition first. What do you do then? You close the doors behind you. I checked the latch on the guest house door and slid the bolt. Back on the bench, I kept my headlamp off and watched the ceiling. The weight moved again, slow, deliberate, step, step, above me, from one end of the room to the other, and then back, as if a walkway ran along the joists where no architect had meant one. The steps stopped over the door. The bolt didn't move. Something like a fingertip traced the joint between door and frame, a curious, patient line. I said, not loud, "I'm a guest." The weight withdrew, polite. Near midnight the bell-cote spoke once, a single, spare note. No wind moved. The note arrived without source and left without echo. I stood and crossed to the courtyard and looked up. No bell hung in the cote. It had been removed long ago, the weathered beam bare. Still the air around the opening felt thin, like a throat after a shout. In the main building, a window far down the east walk held light high and steady, as if someone had set a lamp just inside the room and left to fetch something. I gave myself the mercy of not following. Back in the guest house, I found a Bible on the lower shelf and opened it at random like a bad habit. The page offered a psalm about keeping watch. I almost laughed. I slept in patches. Before dawn I woke to a sound, like a hem dragging on raw wood, then a pause, then that sound again. I rolled carefully and looked at the ceiling, as if what moved might see through boards. Dust drifted down in a straight line from a knothole. I waited for a face to present itself there, because imagination is a traitor. Instead, very gently, something tapped 3 times on the wood above me. The rhythm was precise and human. After the 3rd tap, a second set of taps answered from the direction of the main building, farther away, like a call and response practiced so long it had outlived language. I lay there with my mouth closed until the gray came to the window. In the morning, I walked the perimeter because it helps to count the edges of a thing that has been counting you. In the dew along the cloister walk between the guest house and the main building, I found footprints too regular for animals, too old-fashioned for sneakers, soft-soled, narrow, the heel worn evenly rather than on one side, the way people who spend their days on stone learn to walk. They went in a line and then split, one branch to the chapel door, one to a side door that stood boarded. Where the line met the boarded door, the grass beside the threshold had a part worn into it like hair combed back 1,000 times and given up. I left wood, more than I used, because I'm capable of learning, and I closed every door because the note had underlined it, and underlining is a language. On the table, I left my thanks in a hand less tidy than the one on the note. When I reached the car, the sun had lifted enough to flatten the valley into a map. I sat there with the keys in my hand and watched the bellcote. A swallow came and went like a thought. Nothing else moved. On the drive down the gravel, no sign announced the place had ever had a name. Later, in the town museum, a volunteer with a set of keys that sounded like Sister Thomasin's showed me a folder. "The Abbey?" she said, as if I were asking about a cousin. "Last sisters left in the 80s. Roof went bad, money got thin. They meant to sell, but you know how deeds are when people make vows. The archdiocese put it in a trust. Some hikers use the guest house. We tell them to be respectful of the upstairs." I asked what she meant by upstairs. She pointed to a photo that showed the plan. "There wasn't one," she said, "just the roof beams, but folks here walking." She looked at me to see if that would be a problem I could afford to have. "They kept the hours," she added, as if that explained a behavior. In a way, it did. I don't have a conclusion warmer than this. Some places keep their timetable, even after the people who wrote it down leave the clocks behind. If you sleep in a house that learned silence by body memory, close the doors the way it asks, and don't talk across the hours that don't belong to you. If you see light step from window to window at a pace you can recognize as human, let the procession pass. If weight crosses a ceiling where no floor was ever built, don't go hunting for stairs. There are walks we're not invited to join, and prayers that work best when you only keep them by standing still. If you find yourself on the ridge at dusk, and the bell speaks once, without a bell to carry it, count that as proof, not of ghosts, or of your own good sense, but that time likes a place that knows how to hold it.